It started out like any other trip we'd planned. Just two women wanting to get away from everything for a few days and hike through the Smoky Mountains. We had backpacked together before, so we knew how to handle ourselves out there. We were both careful and prepared, carrying the usual gear. Tents, sleeping bags, food, water filters, and everything else that made us feel safe. We weren't the type to take unnecessary risks, but that night would teach us just how quickly things could turn strange even when you think you're smart. We picked a spot to camp well off the main trail. We wanted privacy, and also to avoid the crowds that sometimes made those areas feel less peaceful than they should. It was late September, and the air was cool and crisp, the kind of cold that wakes you up in the middle of the night but feels refreshing once you're used to it. The trees around us were tall and thick, mostly oaks and maples, their leaves just starting to turn that rusty orange color the mountains are famous for. The ground was soft with layers of fallen leaves and pine needles, muffling our footsteps as we walked back and forth to set up camp. Our tent was a small, lightweight two-person model, easy to set up and sturdy enough for most weather. We pitched it on a flat patch near a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. The only thing nearby was a large old tree right next to the tent, its bark rough and dark, twisted with age. The forest around us felt alive with the usual sounds: crickets, distant hoots of owls, the rustle of leaves as small animals moved around in the underbrush. Nothing felt off at first. We ate dinner by the small campfire we made, careful not to leave it unattended, and cleaned up before nightfall. We were used to keeping things quiet after dark, respecting the wildlife and the solitude of the woods. Around 9 p.m., we got into the tent, zipped it up tight, and settled in for the night. I had my headlamp handy, and we both kept our phones close in case of emergency, though we knew the service was spotty at best that far back. For a long time, everything was normal. The sounds of the forest faded to a gentle background noise as we both drifted towards sleep. But sometime around 2:30 a.m., I woke up with a start. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still and quiet. Then I heard it again. 3 sharp knocks, quick and deliberate, like someone was tapping hard on wood. The sound came from behind our tent, somewhere just out of sight, where the trees grew thickest. My heart started to race. I nudged my friend, whispering, but she was already awake, eyes wide and alert. We froze, listening. The knocks stopped, and the woods fell silent again. For about 10 minutes, we heard nothing but the occasional call of an owl far off in the distance. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was some animal or a branch falling, the knocks came again. This time, they were closer, louder. The timing was so precise it felt like someone or something was trying to send a message. Neither of us moved or said a word. We just lay there, wide-eyed and tense, straining to hear what would come next. The silence stretched longer than felt natural. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the sound changed. Something scraped slowly and deliberately along the outside of our tent wall. It was a dragging noise, like fingernails or claws moving down fabric. The noise was slow, steady, and unnerving. I tried to hold my breath, but my friend suddenly shouted, breaking the tension. The scraping stopped immediately. Neither of us slept after that. We stayed wide awake, staring into the dark, half expecting to see something outside the thin walls of the tent. We whispered quietly, trying to make sense of what we'd heard, but there was no logical explanation that fit. The forest around us stayed quiet, as if holding its breath too. At first light, we slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cool morning air felt sharp and fresh. The sun was just rising, and its soft light filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the ground. Everything looked peaceful, normal, even beautiful after the tension of the night. But then we saw it. Right in front of our tent was a neat pile of small rocks. They weren't just scattered randomly. Someone had stacked them deliberately in a small, balanced heap. It felt like a sign or a marker, placed there after the night's events. The rocks looked fresh, like they hadn't been there before we went to sleep. Our eyes then caught something else. The tree right beside the tent, the big old one with thick bark, had a long, deep gash running vertically down its trunk. The bark was torn away in a jagged strip, as if something had scraped hard against it. The scratch marks were wide and rough, too big to be made by an animal like a bear or a raccoon. The bark's raw surface was still fresh and damp from sap, the edges dark where the tree's bark had been ripped. We took photos and measured the gash, then packed up as quickly as we could. The feeling of being watched, of something unseen but close, lingered heavy in the air. Neither of us wanted to stay another minute. We made it back to the nearest ranger station about 3 hours later, shaking and tired but eager to tell someone what happened. The ranger listened quietly, nodded, then gave a warning that chilled us even more. "We've had a few reports from that hollow," he said. "Try not to camp there again." No explanation, no comfort, just a warning. We left the mountains that day, changed by what we experienced. The woods that had felt peaceful and safe now seemed unpredictable, even dangerous in ways we couldn't explain. We never went back to that spot, and I can't say I'll ever forget the sound of those knocks or the scrape on the tent. Out there, in the quiet dark, you realize just how small and vulnerable you are. And sometimes the forest isn't just alive, it's watching. It was a late October morning when my friends and I decided to hike deep into the Pennsylvania woods. We'd all done plenty of hikes before, but this time we wanted to go farther and spend the night. The forest was thick, with tall pines and oaks whose leaves were just starting to turn yellow and orange against the gray sky. The air was crisp, and a low fog hung between the trees in the early hours, but as the sun climbed, it burned off slowly. There were 4 of us, me, Tom, Sarah, and Mike. We loaded up our packs early and drove to a small trailhead on a back road that cuts through some state forest land. The trail wasn't well marked, but Tom had downloaded some GPS tracks. None of us were experts, but we'd all been out enough to know how to get by. We started out around 9 a.m., stepping on a soft bed of pine needles and dry leaves. The woods were quiet except for birds calling and the crunch of our boots. We joked and talked as usual, but as we walked farther, the trees got thicker, and the trail narrowed until it was just a faint line through the underbrush. I liked that part. It felt like we were really out there, not just on some popular path. About 2 hours in, something strange caught my eye. We were walking through a small clearing, maybe 200 yards wide, with tall trees all around. Off to the side, just standing among the trees, was a man. He was wearing a bright red coat that stood out like a beacon against the dull colors of the forest. At first, I thought maybe he was a hunter or another hiker, but he wasn't moving at all, just standing there perfectly still. I stopped and pointed him out. "Hey, look," I said, nodding toward him. The others stopped too and squinted. The man didn't turn his head or move a muscle. His posture was straight, and he looked directly in our direction, but there was no sign he even noticed us. I waved my hand, hoping to get a reaction, but nothing. Mike waved as well. Still no movement. After a moment, Sarah whispered, "That's weird." The red coat seemed unnatural somehow, like it didn't belong in the woods. We kept walking, trying not to stare, but the man stayed in the same spot, watching silently as we moved on. We stayed on the trail, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that settled over us. For the next couple of hours, we saw no sign of the man again. The woods stayed quiet except for the usual forest sounds. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing near a creek and decided to set up camp. It was about 5 miles from the trailhead, deep enough that cell service was gone, and the only sound was the running water and the wind rustling through the trees. We pitched our tents, gathered wood, and started a fire. The sun was low, casting long shadows. We cooked some hot dogs and heated canned beans over the fire, laughing and talking about old stories. It was the kind of easy, comfortable night you expect when camping with good friends. After dinner, we settled in for the night. Sarah and Mike took one tent, Tom and I the other. The fire was dying down, and we all got quiet, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, and a breeze whispered through the branches. Around midnight, I was asleep when I heard a soft rustling outside the tent. I didn't think much of it at first, probably a raccoon or a squirrel. But then Tom suddenly sat up, whispering, "I need to pee." He unzipped the tent and slipped out, A minute later, I heard him freeze. I was about to ask what was wrong when the tent flap opened again. Tom's voice was tense. "Guys, come out here. Now." We scrambled out, blinking into the dark. The fire had long gone out. Our small flashlight beams caught something at the edge of the clearing, near the treeline. There he was, the man in the red coat. He was standing perfectly still, just like before. No expression, no movement. The moonlight filtered weakly through the clouds, casting a pale light that made the red of his coat almost glow against the dark woods behind him. Tom was shaking. He's just standing there, watching. We didn't say anything, just stared. It was like he'd been waiting for us. None of us knew what to do or say. We called out quietly, but there was no response. Then, as if sensing we were watching, the man turned his head slowly. Just a small tilt, barely noticeable, and disappeared into the trees. No noise, no rustling, just gone. We all looked at each other. My heart was pounding. "We need to get out of here," I said quietly. We gathered our gear in silence, the air thick with tension. Nobody wanted to break the quiet except for the sound of snapping twigs underfoot as we moved back toward the trail. Morning came slow and cold. We huddled around a weak fire, uneasy and exhausted from a night that felt longer than it was. As the sun rose higher, we decided to pack up and head back the way we came. That's when we noticed the prints. There were clear boot prints in the soft earth around our tents, large, heavy boots, probably size 12 or bigger. They led from the edge of the woods straight to our camp, then back into the forest the way the man had disappeared. None of us had heard anything close to footsteps in the night. We checked the camp thoroughly. No signs that anyone had been near the tents except those prints. We didn't wait to question it. We left everything behind: tents, gear, food, backpacks. Just ran back through the woods, hardly stopping to breathe. When we reached the parking lot, our legs were trembling. None of us spoke much on the drive home. The man in the red coat stayed with us in our minds, like a shadow that wouldn't lift. We never went back. To this day, I still think about that man. How he knew where we'd camp. How he waited for us silently in the dark. The red coat, the quiet watching. Something about it wasn't right. But what? It wasn't a ghost or some monster. It was a man, real and flesh and blood, but one who chose to remain hidden, silent, and still. I don't know if he was a hunter, a trapper, or something else. What I do know is that some parts of the woods are not safe, even if you don't hear a thing. And sometimes just standing there waiting is enough. It was late October in northern Ontario, and the first snow had just started to fall the day we arrived. The forest was quiet and cold, with a thin blanket of white covering the ground and the bare branches of the trees. My buddy and I had planned this hunting trip for months. We both needed the break from work, and the chance to get some game before the deep freeze hit was hard to pass up. We set up our camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines and birches. The trees were tall and close together, blocking most of the weak daylight that filtered through the thick gray sky. We got the tent pitched just as dusk was settling in, and the temperature dropped quickly. I remember the cold biting through my jacket when I stepped out of the tent to gather some firewood. The snow was wet but not deep yet, sticking to my boots and making soft crunching sounds with each step. We built a fire near the tent, the flames crackling and sending little sparks into the cold air. We cooked some simple dinner, canned stew warmed over the fire, and settled in early. The forest was dark, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of a branch or the soft rustle of snow falling from a tree limb. That first night, the wind was low, but I kept hearing something moving just beyond the ring of firelight. At first, I thought it was just the usual wildlife, maybe a moose or a bear moving through the trees. The breaking branches and crunching snow were nothing out of the ordinary for this kind of place. But as the night went on, the noises didn't go away. They came closer, then drifted back again. I figured maybe it was a curious animal or some small group of deer. Around 2 a.m., the noises got louder. The sound of twigs snapping was right at the edge of our firelight. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I didn't say anything. My buddy was already asleep. I sat there, eyes fixed on the tree line, but saw nothing moving. After a while, the sound stopped and I managed to fall asleep too, though not very deeply. When we woke up the next morning, the camp was quiet. The snow had stopped falling overnight, and the sky was still heavy with gray clouds. I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed the footprints. They were all around our campsite, circling it twice in a perfect ring. The snow was soft enough to leave clear marks, and these prints looked fresh, made sometime during the night. At first, I thought maybe it was just another hunter or someone else camping nearby, but there was no other sign of people. The footprints were bare human prints, no boots or shoes, just naked feet pressed into the snow. But something was off. The toes of the prints pointed toward the tent, but the heel marks didn't line up the way they should. It looked like whoever or whatever had made them was walking backwards. The gait was wrong, the steps awkward and strange. I tried to figure it out, turning the prints around in the snow to see if maybe I was mistaken. But no matter how I looked at it, the footprints only made sense if someone had been walking backwards the entire time. The prints started from the tree line, went in a perfect circle twice around our fire pit and tent, then disappeared back into the woods. There were no breaks or gaps, no other prints crossing them, nothing to suggest it was a prank or a mistake. I called my buddy out to see. He didn't say much, just shook his head and looked over the prints. We packed up as quickly as we could after that. The last thing I wanted was to spend another night there. On the drive out of the forest, the trees were thick and close together, shadows falling across the snow-covered road. Just as we were rounding a bend, my buddy pointed. I looked toward the edge of the tree line and saw a pale face staring at us. It was just a face, nothing else visible, and its mouth was open wide, like it was screaming, but there was no sound coming from it. The eyes were dark and fixed on us. It held that look for a moment before disappearing behind the trees. Neither of us said anything for the rest of the drive. We both felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. We got back to town and didn't talk much about what we'd seen. No one I know would believe me anyway. The prints, the strange way they walked backward, that face in the trees. It didn't fit any story I've ever heard from hunters or outdoorsmen. I keep going back to the prints in my mind, wondering how something human could walk like that. I've heard of animals that walk on their hind legs or move in strange ways, but these were definitely human footprints, and the way they circled our camp without making a sound, without stepping forward, it was something else. I don't know if it was some weird animal, some person trying to freak us out, or something we can't explain, but I'm done with hunting in that part of the woods. There's something there that doesn't want to be found, something that watches but never shows itself fully, and it walks backwards. I set out early that morning, alone, with my backpack tight on my shoulders and my boots crunching on the gravel trail. The Adirondacks had always been a place I could get lost in, both in the woods and in thought. I wasn't on a big mission or anything, just needed to get away from the noise of the city and clear my head. My plan was to hike a few miles on a well-marked trail I'd done before, but then I saw it, an old logging trail branching off quietly into the trees. It wasn't on my map, and it looked rough, like nobody had been down it in decades. But something about it pulled me in. Figured, why not? It was early, the sun was high, and I was alone with nothing but time. So I left the main trail and started down the logging path. The trees were thick and tall. The sunlight dappled through the canopy, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. The trail was uneven, strewn with roots and rocks, and sometimes faded under a carpet of dead leaves. Felt like stepping back in time. For about an hour, I kept walking. The trail wound deeper into the forest, sloping gently downhill, and I noticed the signs of old logging operations. Rusted spikes hammered into trees, broken down machinery parts half buried in moss, and stacks of weathered logs that looked like they'd been left to rot decades ago. There was a quiet calm in the woods, a kind of timelessness. I heard a woodpecker tapping somewhere high up, and the faint chirp of a bird nearby, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the brush. But then, after about an hour, something changed. The forest went completely silent. I stopped and listened. No birds, no insects buzzing, No wind whispering through the branches. Nothing but the muffled sound of my own breathing and footsteps. The silence was so thick it almost felt like a weight pressing in on me. My skin prickled. I checked my watch. 2:17 p.m. I told myself it was just a quiet moment. Maybe the birds had stopped singing for a second, but the silence stretched on and on. The air felt heavier too, like the forest had gone still and held its breath. I looked around and realized something else. None of the usual sounds of nature that I'd expect were there. The normal background noise that makes a forest feel alive was gone. I tried to shake off the feeling, but a knot of unease grew in my stomach. I decided to turn back. I'd gone far enough. Besides, the trail wasn't on my map, and I didn't want to wander too deep. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. The trees around me didn't look the same. Their bark was rougher, twisted, almost blackened in places like they'd been burned long ago. The underbrush was denser and tangled, and the trail beneath my feet was less clear. There was no way this had been the path I'd come in on. I stopped to check my watch again. It still read 2:17 p.m., the same exact time. My heart started to beat faster. I looked down the path behind me, the way I'd come, and nothing looked familiar. No signposts, no broken logs or rusty spikes, just thick woods closing in from every side. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Maybe I'd gotten turned around, or the trail had forked and I'd accidentally taken a different path. I told myself to stay calm and to find my way back to the main trail. I started walking faster. The silence was still there, deep and unbroken. No birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, like I was walking through a thick carpet of moss instead of dry leaves. The air was cool but humid, making it hard to breathe. I kept looking at my watch, hoping time was moving forward, but the hands refused to budge. 2:17 p.m. Panic started to rise. I broke into a run, the underbrush snagging at my legs, branches slapping my face, the uneven ground making my footing unsure. My breath came fast, and my heart hammered in my chest like a drum. I wanted out. I wanted to get back to the real world, the trail I knew. I pushed on, through the heavy silence, my senses on edge. The forest felt alien, like I was trapped in some place that looked like the Adirondacks but wasn't really. The trees leaned in closer, their twisted shapes casting dark shadows, and the sky above was hidden by thick branches. I could almost feel the forest watching me, though I knew that was just my mind trying to make sense of the fear. After what felt like an eternity running through that strange stretch of woods, I finally stumbled out onto a wider, well-worn trail. The air changed instantly. The forest came back to life. Birds sang loudly, a breeze rustled the leaves, and insects buzzed in the sunlight. The smell of pine and earth was fresh and clean again. I slowed to a stop, chest heaving, and checked my watch. 4:52 p.m. I'd lost over 2 hours. I looked back the way I'd come, toward the dark, twisted trees and silent woods, but the path just ended at a thicket of thick brush. I took a deep breath and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my nerves. How was that possible? I'd only been walking an hour, yet somehow 2.5 hours had disappeared, and the time on my watch hadn't moved the whole time I was on that logging trail. I never found out exactly what happened in those woods that day, but I left the Adirondacks soon after and never went back to that old logging trail. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that heavy silence, and I remember how the forest looked. Twisted trees, thick air, and time standing still. I don't know if it was some kind of strange natural phenomenon, a trick of my mind, or something else entirely, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes, even the most familiar woods can hide something you're not meant to find. And when that happens, time doesn't always work the way you expect. I've been camping alone in the Pacific Northwest plenty of times before. The woods out here are dense, quiet during the day except for birds and the rustle of small animals, and they're big enough to lose yourself if you're not careful. I like the isolation. It helps me clear my head. But this trip, well, it didn't go like the others. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The forest floor was thick with needles, and the air smelled damp and earthy. It was late September, so the nights were chilly but not freezing. I had my gear all ready: sleeping bag, stove, some canned food, water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a hatchet I always carried for protection and chopping firewood. The first day went smooth. I hiked in about 5 miles from the trailhead, picked the clearing I liked, and spent the afternoon gathering wood and setting up camp. I made a small fire and cooked some canned chili. The only sounds were the soft breeze through the trees and the distant call of a crow. Everything felt normal. That night, I went to bed early, planning to get a good rest before hiking more the next day. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was a sound, a slow, off-key whistle. It was just outside my tent, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. The tune was simple, something you could hum without much thought, but wrong somehow, like someone who couldn't quite carry a tune but kept trying. The whistling wasn't loud, but it stood out clearly against the usual night sounds. I froze for a moment, trying to tell if it was an animal or maybe another camper playing a prank. The whistle lasted maybe a minute, then stopped. I called out softly, "Hello?" But no answer came, just silence. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, or maybe some guy drunk in the woods, but something about it didn't feel right. The whistle was too steady, too deliberate. I lay back down but didn't really sleep. I kept thinking about that sound. The next night, the whistle came again. Same time, same tune, but this time it moved. It circled around my tent slowly, going from one side to the other, stopping for a few seconds here and there. I could hear the whistle closer, then farther, but I couldn't see anyone. The trees blocked all views, and my flashlight didn't pick up anything unusual. I stayed still and quiet, my heart pounding. The sound kept going for about 5 minutes before it faded away. I didn't call out this time. I didn't want to encourage whoever or whatever it was. I spent most of that night wide awake, gripping my hatchet next to me. I told myself to stay calm, that it was probably just some local fool messing with campers. But the idea didn't sit well with me. The whistle was so precise, so strange. The third night, I prepared differently. I didn't want to be caught off guard again. I put my boots on and sat outside my tent with my flashlight and the hatchet. I scanned the trees around me, looking for any sign of movement. The fire had burned out hours ago, but the stars were clear above, and a faint mist hung low over the ground. I checked my watch, 2:02 a.m. Then, at exactly 2:03, the whistle started again. Slow, off-key, the same tune. My flashlight swept the area toward the sound. The whistle stopped instantly. The forest was dead silent except for the swaying of the pines in the wind. I shone the light in every direction, expecting maybe to catch a figure. Nothing. No shapes, no eyes reflecting the beam. Just trees, shadows, and the occasional snap of a twig far away. I waited, flashlight steady in my hand, but the whistle never came back. That dawn, I didn't sleep at all. I packed my gear in a hurry and started hiking back to the trailhead. The trail was long, 14 miles to the road, but I didn't stop for anything. No water breaks, no resting. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch made me tense up. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't. When I finally reached the road, I didn't even check my phone. I just got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. For months afterward, I couldn't get that whistle out of my head. It haunted me, not in a nightmare way, but more like a warning I couldn't understand. 2 years later, I was scrolling through news articles online when I saw a story about a missing hiker in the exact area I had camped. The hiker had gone out alone and disappeared without a trace. Search teams found no clues, no gear, no signs of struggle. The only odd detail was a witness who said they heard someone whistling late at night in the forest the night the hiker vanished. The article didn't say much more. No suspects, no explanation. I closed my laptop and sat back, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. That whistle wasn't just a prank or a random sound. It was something real, and it meant trouble. I haven't been back to those woods since.